Hello, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about counting complex rhythms. If you watched our first video, you should have already seen about our rhythm tree and how to count rhythms when they're all together with the same rhythm. And now we're going to talk about how to look at it in music, because when we read rhythms in music, we usually have different rhythms all together. So for starters, let's just review exactly how we're going to be counting and understanding the beat. So these are our quarter notes. They have no beams and no flags on them, and all of these notes are going to be one beat each. That's why they get numbers. And that's also why they get your foot. So we tap our foot with the quarter notes. Awesome. And if we go one step smaller, you guessed it, that's an eighth note. So with our eighth notes, we add our upbeats or our ands. You see those in kind of a pink color here. And remember, our downbeats or our numbers, those all still have our gold numbers on them. Same color as our shoe up there, because that's where our foot goes, even when it's not just quarter notes. So we're playing or counting eighth notes, we still tap our foot with the numbers that we count. Awesome. And one last step, we got 16th notes. So you see our ones and our ands, just like the eighth notes above, but now in these white letters, you've got our e's and uhs. Just more notes going on here. But that's not scary. That's okay. And with our numbers on our downbeats, what happens? That foot. There we go. We're still tapping our foot with the beat. Our beat just has more notes going on inside of it. Awesome. So let's take a step away from this. That should have been review if you watched our first video. And let's talk about counting some rhythms when we see some rests in there and we don't always have our numbers and our beats. So here we have eighth notes and eighth rests. Remember, our eighth notes with our beams, like the first two there, are the same rhythmic value like our eighth notes with our flags. And with this handy dandy guide here, you can see the eighth note with the flag on the and after two. That's just like the eighth notes on one and three and. And on 2 and 4, we've got eighth rests. So if I'm counting my rhythms here, I want to count all of my notes, but I won't count my rests. But rather than moving my 2 and 4 away from my rests, I'm just going to let them fade into the background a little bit. So I'll keep tapping my foot on them because I always want to tap my foot and know where the beat is, but my counting will go 1 and 3 and. Because I'm not going to count my rhythms on the rest because I don't play there, but I'm always going to keep a steady beat and tap my foot and keep track of where I'm going. So you hear a lot of ands in this passage, and you can use this system no matter what the patterns are, and I'm sure we'll get into some awesome patterns coming soon in class. All right, let's talk a little bit more about 16th notes. So here's our 16th note full beat, 1 E and All four of our notes, or sometimes you might hear me call these partials, just because it's partials or parts of a beat. So we've got 4 partials of our beat with 16th notes, and all of them are accounted for at the center of the page. We're going to start looking at what happens when you put an 8th note in there with your 16th notes as we go around here, but keep using this group at the center of the page as your reference if you get confused. So first in the top left, we've got 16th notes, but we also have an 8th note. Remember, counting beams is your friend. How many beams do the first 2 notes touch? Horizontal beams at the top of the group. There are 2 there. There's the big one across the top, and there's the shorter one right under it. And they're both touching the first 2 notes. That makes them 16th notes. But then our second beam stops and doesn't touch the last note. Only one beam touching the note, that's our 8th note. So we've got 2 16th notes, which you'd count 1 E, and then you get to the next note, and it's and, but the next note's an 8th note. So that means we don't count our last 16th note partial, because our 8th note's taking up all that room. You always get rid of a 16th note partial after you run into an 8th note in these groupings. If that gets confusing, again, make sure to look back at the center to see which 16th note we're leaving out because our 8th note took its space. Okay, so this one would be 1 E and. That's 2 16ths and an 8th note. Let's look at a different way to write 2 16ths and an 8th note. Okay, so now down in the bottom left, we've got 2 beams touching our second 2 notes, but only 1 beam that's hitting the first one. That means we're leading off with our 8th note, and then we get to our 16th notes. But remember, it's not hard, it's not crazy. When you have an 8th note, it just takes up the space and you skip the 16th note partial right after it. So we start with our 8th note, 1, And we count eighth notes 1 and, so we're skipping right over our second partial, or our E. And then we're getting to 1 and a, because we got 16th notes to finish out. Awesome. So it works just like the first group did, but this time our eighth note's at the beginning. 1 and a. All right, let's take a look up in the top right of the screen. So this one looks a little busier, but it's not that hard. So our first note has 2 beams attached to it, even though that one beam's real little, still counts. And then our second note has only 1 beam because the little beams on either side don't get to it. And then our third note, it has a beam too, just like the first one. So that means we're slapping our 8th note right in the middle there. So we've got a 16th note on 1, and then an 8th note on E, and then a 16th note at the end on A. With our 8th note being on E, or the second partial in the group, that means we're skipping the partial after. So we don't have and here. No and. So the way we would count this is 1E, A. A little bit goofier, but I think this rhythm is pretty cool. And let's wrap it up by looking at the last way we can write this. Now, obviously, we don't have an 8th note here. The way we're going to write this rhythm is with a 16th rest. That's what that little 8th rest looks like when you add another flag onto it, just like our notes. So we got a 16th rest to start, so we're not going to count in our rest, but then we have 3 good 16th notes right after it. So it would be E and A, without counting on that 1. So here are our 4 different groups of 3-note groupings of 16th notes, all in one beat. We'll work more on different complex rhythms in the future, but for now, I hope that you were able to get some of this information out of this video, and we'll talk more about it in class.